to bombs, World War II was one of the bloodiest wars in the history of the world. With an estimated death toll ranging from 70 million to 85 million, it is the deadliest war in history in terms of human lives lost. World War II lasted for 6 years from 1939 to 1945, but the United States did not join until 1941, in which they joined forces with the Allied powers. Americans were isolationists, which means they did not want to take part in the affairs of other countries. That is until December 7, 1941, in which Japan launched a surprise military strike on Pearl Harbor, a military base in Hawaii. The tragedy that is Pearl Harbor helped the Allied powers triumph in World War II, because without the United States, they would not have helped the Allies in many battles, military operations, and making the Japanese surrender. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor for three main reasons. The first was to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet and crush the American spirit, which would cause America to not be able to interfere in the business of Japan. For example, their conquest of the East Dutch companies and Malia. The second reason was to obtain natural resources. Japan was at war with many nations, so it had an increased demand for resources such as oil, minerals, and steel. Finally, the third reason was because the United States stopped doing business with Japan, froze all assets that Japan owned in America, and sanctioned them. During Japan's 2-hour bombardment of Pearl Harbor, it saw the lives of over 2,300 killed, and 1,000 more were injured for the American side. The large amount of lives that were lost mostly occurred in battleships such as the USS Arizona, which alone made up for nearly half of the casualties, which killed over 1,100 crewmen. The people on these ships were unprepared for an attack, which is what caused such a great loss of life.
In the deadly attack on Pearl Harbor, 21 ships were damaged or destroyed. Along with the ships, many aircraft were also damaged or destroyed. Of all the aircraft at Pearl Harbor, 188 were destroyed and 159 were damaged. This attack did not only cost the lives of the people, but it was also a financial hit to the United States, because of the 21 ships damaged, 3 could not be repaired. The many ships stationed at Pearl Harbor amounted to a large sum of money. For example, the USS Arizona was a ship docked at Pearl Harbor that took immense damage from the bombs dropped. It cost the United States around $16 million to build. That would be equal to $405 million in 2018. The US did not only lose the crew, but the ship and the $405 million investment used to build the ship.
Pearl Harbor affected the United States by pushing the Americans to join World War II. United States citizens felt that they didn't need to help other countries at the time and decided to stay out of World War II. While this was true, the President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that they would inevitably go join the war, but he also recognized the anti-war sentiment the Americans felt. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Americans felt wounded and felt the need to avenge their fellow Americans that perished in Pearl Harbor. D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. It was when 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches along heavily fortified coast in Normandy. It displayed how the Allied forces used coordinated plans to invade Normandy. D-Day was actually supposed to happen on June 5, 1944. However, Eisenhower, the commander of the Normandy invasion, delayed the invasion after consulting his meteorologist. The Allies planned precise, elaborate plans for the enormous cross-channel invasion, codenamed Overlord, planned to happen on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Bertram H. Ramsay, British admiral, had complete command of the naval operation codenamed Neptune, and Bernard Montgomery, British general, exercised complete command of the land forces. There were 5 areas planned for attack, all given code names: Utah, Oma, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces at Utah Beach faced heavy resistance. Landings at Oma had even more casualties the Americans received there as well. By the end of the day, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives and thousands more wounded.
The U.S. participated in the planning of many military operations, such as Operation Torch, an operation that would see through the invasion of Vichy French-held North Africa. It was the first time American and British forces worked together. Torch was a resounding success and showed the Allies the strength of American ingenuity, which would help them win the war. Operation Torch was an operation that would be split into 3 parts: the Western Task Force, Center Task Force, and Eastern Task Force. The Western Task Force would attack Casablanca in 3 smaller operations called Blackstone, Brushwood, and Goalpost, which would capture Safi, Fidala, and Media Portlotti. Center Task Force would attack the city of Oran. The forces were split into 3 groups. 2 would land on the west side and 1 in the east. Multiple issues faced the western group, such as a sighting of a French convoy and the lack of intel, but they were still able to successfully attack Oran. The eastern portion of the forces were able to quickly take the shore. However, 2 of their ships were destroyed after attempting to not damage the facilities on the port. Even though the French saw an initial victory, they were unable to sustain their lead as most of their ships were sunk and or driven ashore along with heavy artillery fire from the British. Oran was forced to surrender, making the second part of the operation a success. The Eastern Task Force's plan was to invade Algiers. This started with the coup led by Henry d'Astir Lavigueur and José Albocour, who captured many important points, including the governor's house and the house of General Alphonse Wien. They did this with the intent of convincing him to join the Allies. This ultimately failed as the local gendarmerie, or police, came and arrested them and their group in the morning. Besides the failed coup, a normal attack was planned similar to the attack on Oran, with 2 forces splitting into the west and 1 to the east. The battle was interesting as many landings by the Allies were on the wrong beach, and on the French side, French resistance took out coastal barriers. The only fighting that took place was on the port of Algiers, and was similar to the fighting done in Oran, in that they also tried to land at the port without damaging any facilities. The French were able to destroy 1 British destroyer with heavy artillery. However, it didn't matter as the rest of the troops were able to land and quickly forced the surrender of General Wien.
After 6 years of onslaught battle, the Axis powers were coming to an end. With the surrender of Germany and Italy, the only Axis power yet to surrender was Japan. Japan was not going to surrender because of the concept of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, which made the Japanese think that it was an honor and their duty to die for their country. An example of this during World War II was the various kamikaze attacks, where a Japanese aircraft was loaded with explosives and made to crash into enemies, thus killing the pilot and their target. So, when the Allied powers made Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, Japan decided to make their own operation, Operation Katsugo. Operation Katsugo was that the Japanese thought that they could make the invasion so costly and bloody that the price to invade them would be too high to afford. President Truman, knowing of the horrific cost that the invasion of Japan would be, ordered for a new weapon to be used to bring the war to a quick end. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It caused an estimated death toll of 146,000 people and the destruction of the city. Japan thought that since atomic bombs were so expensive to make that the US wouldn't have another until some time, or that they only had a few available, and that they would suffer another if needed. And suffer another they did, because on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. It cost an estimated 80,000 deaths. The Emperor knew that defeat was inevitable and decided to surrender. On September 2, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, thus ending World War II. If it weren't for the tragedy that is Pearl Harbor, the US would have joined the war at a much later time or not joined the war at all. The US played a big part because they helped in many military operations such as Torch to obtain advantage points in the war, D-Day, an important factor that contributed to the end of World War II in Europe, and if it were not for the US bombing Japan, the Japanese would have been able to do Operation Katsugo and make the war even bloodier than it already was.